Hey guys, it's Ernesto. Welcome back to another Monday Critique. I hope you guys are having a fantastic Monday. I'm having a wonderful Monday. Today we have two great images to critique and I can't wait to get into it. So I'll talk to you guys after this intro. If you guys want to submit your image to be critiqued, please join our Facebook group. It's called Fine Art Photography and Modeling. In that group, I created a specific thread where you could submit your images to be critiqued. All right, guys, welcome back. So we're gonna get straight into it. So the very first image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much for submitting your image. Let's get into it. All right, guys, so let's talk about the lighting in this image. So from a lighting perspective, the creator of this image utilized window light, which is one of my most favorite light sources to utilize. Now, when I look at this image, I get captivated by this image every time I look at it. So great job with that. The thing about utilizing window light, which is the technique I generally utilize for the most part, I would say maybe 80% of the time I utilize it when I'm working with window light. Now, the technique is simply this. When you're working with window light or any basically light source, the main light source, you want to basically turn your subject's body away from that light source and then turn your subject's head back into that light source. Now, the reason for that is it adds a little bit of texture in the shadow side of the subject's body and it contours the face nicely by providing a nice little shadow in the shadow side of the subject's face. So that creates some nice little depth and dimension in your image by utilizing that technique. Now, another thing that I utilize when I'm working with window light, and that is spot metering. I don't know what metering mode you specifically used in this image. If you use like evaluative metering in your camera, what happens with evaluative metering is this. If you have basically exposing for this particular area, your camera would say, okay, well, I need to take an average of what's going on in this frame. And for the most part, the camera is going to say, well, wait a minute here. We have a whole bunch of shadow area in this frame. So therefore it's going to say, well, I need to bump up your exposure a little bit because there's too much shadow and you probably need a little bit of detail in that shadow. So what will end up happening is the light will be a little bit overexposed on the subject's face, which is exactly what's happening in this image. So what I tend to utilize is spot metering. I basically meter for that hot spot on the subject's face. In that way, I will have a proper exposure with respect to the light on the subject's face. Now, what will end up happening is the shadows will become deeper because you are now exposing for that hot spot on the subject's face. So what you actually end up doing in post is basically bringing up the details in that shadow area. So I think if you use the spot metering in this image, it would help with that hot spot on the subject's face. So by utilizing those two techniques, which is basically turning the subject's body away from the main light source and the head back into the light, and then utilizing spot metering, would have helped reduce that hot spot on the subject's face. And I hope that was helpful. All right, guys, now let's get into the posing of this image. So from a posing perspective, I really love this image. It's really captivating me and the pose is really casual and nice. There's only one thing that's distracting me. And let's talk about this video that I did again. So the video is up here again. I can't link it again, but if you hit that info button, you'll be able to get to it again. In that video, I believe it was the very last image that I captured in that video. And in that image, I was going for capturing the emotion, the laughter of the subject, right? And as she was going back and forth, playing with her hair, and I'm trying to get that expression out of her by her laughing loud and everything. The one problem I encountered was this. I got the expression, that's what I was going for, where she was laughing and all that good stuff. But the one problem that I encountered is a distraction. And that distraction was her hand. Her hand, if you look at that image, is very distracting to me. So here's a couple of challenges that I face, right? So the one thing that I try to do with these types of images that's a little bit distracting to me when I look at it is, one, it doesn't end up in my portfolio. The client may love it because the expression is there and they may not necessarily know what to look for as far as distracting elements, right? But for me, when I look at the image, it's a little bit distracted to me because the hands is there, okay? The expression is great, but that hand is there and it's a little bit distracting away from me. So those types of images don't end up in my portfolio. So that being said, when I look at your image, beautiful subject, you capture it really well. But when I look at it, the one thing that distracts me from your image is the same thing that distracts me away from my image, which is the hand. So I would say, and especially because the palm of the hand is facing the camera, is just too prominent in this image, and it just basically distracts me away from your subject. But overall, I think you did a great job with your pose, and I think you did a great job, again, a wonderful expression from your subject. So with that said, I'll move on to the next topic. All right, guys, so now let's move on to the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, overall, the composition is great. There's only two things that I would adjust with respect to the composition. The very first thing is, if you look at the top left of the frame, there's just a little gap of the background and our hair. So the only thing that I would have done there from a compositional perspective is just come in a little bit closer to basically eliminate that gap. Is it a big deal? Not that much of a big deal, but it's just a little bit distracting. So that's what I would have done, me personally, to help eliminate that distraction. The second thing, it goes back to the same thing that we were talking about with respect to the hands. So if I noticed that hand was there, the one thing I would have done is probably change my composition, which is probably go vertical. Maybe she couldn't move her hand, maybe her hands needed to stay where it was, but I probably try to go vertical and try to eliminate that hand with my composition. So those are the only two things that I would have done with respect to the composition. But overall, those two things are very minor. So we'll move on from there. All right, guys, now let's get into the last thing in this image, which is post-production. So from a post-production perspective, overall, I think you did a great job. There's just a couple of things I would adjust with respect to this image. The first thing I would adjust is the light. Now the light on her cheek and the light on her clothes is just a little bit overexposed. And what I would have done in post is basically reduce that exposure just a little bit to bring back some of that detail in those areas. Now the next thing I would have done from a post-production perspective is eliminate that little gap on the top right hand corner of this image, which is basically just fill in that little gap between her hair and that background. I would have used her hair to basically clone in and cover up that area. Now the last thing I would have done in this image is warm up the image just a little bit. And I think if you've done those three things to this image, which is minor, so overall I think you did a great job with the post-production. So thank you very much. All right, guys, now let's move on to image number 2. So this image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much for submitting your image. Let's get into it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is light. Now in this image, the image creator utilized a reflector as the main light source in this image. Now we utilized the silver side of the reflector in this image. When I look at the light on the subject, the light appears to be a little bit too powerful. So what I would suggest here is moving back the light source just a little bit so that the power is not as strong. Or I would have basically reduced my exposure on my camera to help with that exposure. because right now the exposure on the subject is just a little bit too harsh. The other thing I would have done with the reflector is to utilize the gold side of the reflector with respect to this subject. Utilizing the gold side of the reflector, especially if you have a reflector that has the mixture of gold and silver in it, I would have utilized that gold side to help bounce some light into the subject, and it would have been great for this subject and her skin tone. Now you have to be careful with that because you don't want it to be too powerful, like with respect to what's happening here with your light. So you may have to back off a little bit with that gold side of the reflector so it's not so overwhelming. All right, so one other thing that I would have done with respect to the lighting source in this image is I would have raised that reflector up just a little bit so it's more elevated above the subject, so the light source is coming down on the subject as opposed to coming from the side. Now that's what it appears to be to me, that the light source is coming from the side. Now the reason I say that is because if you look at the subject's hands, you will notice that there's a heavy concentration of light on that subject's hands. So that's what I would have done to help eliminate some of that distraction, which is the light on the subject hands, by elevating that light a little bit up or feathering that light just a little bit, which you can do with a reflector. So those are the things that I would have done with respect to the lighting source in this image to help enhance it just a little bit more. And I hope that was helpful. All right, guys, now let's move on to the pose in this image. So when I look at this image, the very first thing that I connect to in this image is the subject's eyes. So great job in pulling that expression out of the subject. There's only one thing that distracts me away from this image with respect to the pose, and that is her hands. Now, when you're working with hands, you generally want hands to be on different planes, and you generally want hands to be doing two different things. You don't want hands to be doing exactly the same thing, because when it's doing exactly the same thing, it becomes a distraction, as it is in this image. So by having both hands positioned on the shoulder, it just calls attention to it. So what I would have suggested that you have done in this image is basically have one hand on the shoulder and perhaps have her other hand on her head or her cheek, or have it hanging down, not even being in the shot. But you want both hands to be doing something different. If they're both doing the same thing, it becomes a distraction. So that's the only thing I have to say with respect to the pose in this image, and I hope it was helpful. All right, guys, hey, welcome back. Let's get into the other section. Let's get into the other section, which is composition. So from a compositional perspective, so let's talk about a composition. When I look at this image, there's a couple of things that just distracts me away from the subject just a little bit with respect to the composition. The very first thing that distracts me away from this image with respect to the composition is her hairline. Now, this is applicable to women and men, both. So generally, you don't want to cut off a subject's head where it would appear that they will have a forever hairline. And here's what I mean by that. When you're cropping an image, especially the head, if I was gonna photograph someone, male or female, the one thing I don't want to do is basically crop the image where it's like here, right? Where my hairline is right here. So you don't want to basically cut off my image. So if this is the top of the frame, you don't want to cut off the image right here where it just appears, okay, like my hairline is just gonna go on forever, okay? When you're cropping an image, especially a hairline image, here's a couple of things that you don't want to do or should do. First thing is, when you're cropping an image, you want to make sure that you crop the image to include the person's hairline or exclude the hairline completely. If you hedge in between that and you try to include some of the hairline or eliminate some of the hairline, what ends up happening is you give the subject the appearance of a forever forehead. So what you want to do is include the hairline or exclude the hairline completely. By doing that, it won't give that appearance of the person having a forever forehead. All right, guys, now let's get on to the last thing in this image. So the last thing in this image is post-production. So from a post-production perspective, here's a couple of things I would suggest for the post-production. The first thing that I noticed when I look at this image, it just appears to be a little bit washed out. And what I mean by that is it appears like there's no color in the image. Now, adding a little bit of warmth to this image would have helped. It would add a little bit more life to the subject's skin, okay? That would be the first thing. The other thing I would have done in this image is drop the exposure just a little bit in post, because that would help with that little bit of overexposure that we have going on here in this image that we talked about in the lighting section. So the last thing I would like to say with respect to this image and the post-production is about transitioning light and shadow on the subject's skin. By blending those two things, light and shadow, and having a smooth transition would help with the blemishes and all that good stuff. It would just help make the image a little bit more polished by doing that. So that just comes with time. One of the things that helps me in post to help see where those transitions need to be is by looking at the image in black and white, and you could clearly see where those transition needs to be. So that's what I would suggest in this image from a post-production perspective, and I hope those tips were helpful. All right, guys, now let's get into the rating of these two images. Light, I gave this image a 3. Pose, I gave this image a 4. Composition, I gave this image a 4. Post-production, I gave this image a 4. Overall, this image received a rating of 3.75 out of 5. All right, guys, now let's get on to image number 2. Light, I gave this image a 2. Pose, I gave this image a 2. Composition, I gave this image a 3. Post-production, I gave this image a 2. Overall, this image received a rating of 2.25 out of 5. All right, guys, thank you so much for submitting your images. I sincerely appreciate it. I hope the tips that I provided was helpful to you, and I hope it was helpful to the viewers. Guys, if you have any additional comments over and above the feedback that I provided, please drop those comments down below. That will help not only me, but it would also help the image creators. So again, thank you very much. That is it. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with your friends and family. And please put some feedback down below and let me know what you think about this video. And guys, if you got this far in the video, you must be enjoying this content and you must be enjoying this channel. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next Monday.